everyone for coming to this talk. I'm going to be talking to you about accessibility. I know this is not kind of a JavaScript meetup, and this talk is not going to be kind of pure JavaScript. Web accessibility is a really interdisciplinary area. It's very broad. So I'm going to focus on giving you a broad overview. I'm not sure what everyone's relevant backgrounds and experiences are. So really kind of the aim of this talk is to be kind of aim for breadth rather than depth, give you a good starting point so that you can learn a bit about the topic and then develop your interests further in your own time. A lot of the stuff that we'll be covering is probably quite from a dev perspective, quite front end focused. But even if you are diehard back-end developer, chances are you will work with people or be building perhaps your own portfolio or something, in which case you will still have a use for this knowledge, even if it's just to remind other people on your team about different issues in this area, or to apply in your own projects in your own time. Right, so without further ado, let me just quickly go through what I'm gonna try and talk about. Basically, I'll be going through the whats, the whys, and the hows. I kind of said that this is probably about a 30-minute talk, but I like the sound of my own voice, so it might overrun. I'll do my best to keep on time, but we'll just see how it goes. And we'll save all questions for the end. Yeah. So what do we mean when we talk about accessibility and web accessibility? So the kind of official definition is as follows. I promise this is probably the biggest chunk of text you'll see for this presentation, but essentially what we talk about when we mean web accessibility is that websites, tools, and technologies have been designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And specifically, people are able to perceive, understand, navigate, interact with, and contribute to the web. I've highlighted contribute here, just as a reminder for myself to mention that accessibility, again, is a massive topic, and one really interesting area which I don't know anything about, but is really interesting, and I recommend you guys go and look into more, is how to make things accessible. We're going to be focusing more on how to make things accessible for your average user, but there's a whole other area of web accessibility, which is making the web accessible for people like us who have impairments and disabilities. So, for example, how do you build a code editor that a blind dev can use? That, again, is not an area that I'll be touching on in this presentation, but also really important to bear in mind and think about. There we go. Another quick note is when you're looking and reading about accessibility online, it's very common to see the acronym A11Y. It essentially comes from the fact that there are 11 letters between the A and the Y in accessibility. So it's an easy way to shorten it if you're writing tweets or something where you're limited in characters. Yeah, I just wanted to give you a heads up about that. So let me just give a kind of a brief overview of what we mean when we're talking about disabilities and impairments. So the World Wide Web Consortium has a web accessibility initiative, and they kind of define these 6 broad categories of types of disability and impairment that kind of we should be aware of and know that these different types of disability will have different methods for interacting with the web. I've just listed, this is by no means an exhaustive list, just a few examples, just to kind of give you a bit of an idea. One important thing to note is that web accessibility isn't just a thing that we do for disabilities on the more extreme end, but also for impairments for example, elderly people or people who are just near or far sighted, There's temporary disabilities like missing limbs and broken limbs. And there's also kind of situational impairments, and all of these things. And even, you know, completely healthy users can benefit from web accessibility features. So, sorry. So yes, this is just a broad kind of overview. And then each of these different types of disability and impairment will have different ways of uniquely interacting with the digital world, which again, I just wanted to highlight. For example, if you have an auditory impairment, you're going to be relying on things like subtitles in video content, transcripts for podcasts. If you have a visual impairment, you'll be relying on screen readers. If you don't know what a screen reader is, essentially it is an application that will literally read out to you what is displayed on the screen, and not just the text content, but actually the role of what each item is on the page. So if something is a header, if something is an image, and things like that. So it kind of gives an audio description of what a user would be seeing on the page. Those with visual impairments also rely on voice notes a lot for social media and chat applications and things like that. For physical disabilities, what you're probably looking at are people that maybe don't use a mouse and rely more on using the keyboard to navigate, so using the tab key to move between different elements on the page, or potentially they do use a mouse, but they might prefer using slower movements, slower cursor movements. Speech impairments, you would rely on text-to-speech applications. You prefer having written contact information for whoever you are trying to communicate with online, as opposed to verbal communication. Cognitive and neurological kind of overlap quite a lot. I am not a psychologist or a neurologist, so please do not ask me to define the exact differences between the two. But people with these kinds of disabilities and impairments will most benefit from the types of fonts that are being used, the language being used, what types of, if it's an educational piece of content, having multiple different formats to account for different learning styles, being able to, the way the content is structured and whether you have animations or not. All of these things can help make people with disabilities and impairments have just a much better user experience. In the most of this talk, I think we'll be focusing mostly on the visual impairments and what we can do to address web accessibility from that angle, maybe a little bit of the physical side as well. But this is, again, like a huge topic. So definitely go and look into all of these other areas when you get the time. All right, so let's move on to the why. Why should we care? Why should we be doing this? Well, the first reason is just like, it's the right thing to do. I would hope that we all want the world to be a more inclusive place, and the digital world as well. A friend of mine actually used a really good metaphor with me the other day, which I really love and I want to share with you guys. And she was saying how architects in the physical world are expected, when they're building something in a public place, to ensure that there's a wheelchair ramp and there's handrails on the stairs, and we kind of come to like expect this, and we don't even notice this anymore. And as software developers, we are essentially the architects of the digital world, so we have the responsibility to make sure that we're building things that are accessible and inclusive to as many people as possible. And also the UN says you got to do it. They have a convention and everything, so that's also another reason. Second of all, in the following countries, there are actual laws in place that say that you need to be building accessible products. That you will need to look up what is the exact legal requirement and to what extent you are obliged to create accessible products. But yeah, especially if you are working in the education sector or any government body, or if you are working with clients who are subject to those laws, like this is an area of web development that you should be aware of and taking into account. There have been, I think, a few cases over the past few years of different big organizations getting sued, particularly in the United States, because their sites are not accessible. Beyonce is one example. And you don't want to be the dev on Beyonce's, like Beyonce doesn't know about how to make a website accessible. Like it's on her devs to make sure that her fans can buy her stuff. And you don't want to be the dev that, disappoints Beyonce and Beyonce's fans. So yeah, like there's a lot of high profile cases around web accessibility. So it's something we should take seriously from a legal perspective as well. Another reason is that according to the World Health Organization, around 15 to 20% of the global population has a disability. And that I think is just referring to kind of official disability, not even considering more minor impairment, something that doesn't, I guess, classify exactly as a disability. So it's a much bigger number than you might have been expecting. And for people with a disability or an impairment, having an accessible site can be the difference between buying your product or not buying your product or not. So you actually kind of stand to lose revenue and lose users if your site is not accessible and maybe your competitors is. And also beyond just that proportion of your users who might need some kind of accessible content, those users will have family and friends and lawyers and sometimes millions of followers who will care if their friend or their loved one cannot use online products. And so that can also have a more far-reaching impact on your brand reputation. And so yeah, definitely something to keep in mind. And final reason, in case the other ones are still not enough to convince you, having a site or a product that is more accessible means it's a better user experience for everyone. Thinking about color contrast can help people who are in bright sunlight. Having a font style and size that is easily readable doesn't just help near and far-sighted people, but also helps just your average user who might be looking at your website on a small screen. And watching videos in a crowded place is much better if you have subtitles on. It also gives you a different way of thinking about web development. It's, I guess, a bit of mental gymnastics, which can kind of potentially give you a more innovative way of thinking about how you're designing and building your sites. And you should also be doing it for your future self. Disabilities are not necessarily permanent things. Like you might be a perfectly able person today, but who knows tomorrow? And even, at the very least, like way in the future, we will all be old and have not as good eyesight and not as speedy kind of physical movement. So if we kind of invest in accessibility now, then hopefully by the time we get to an older age, then we're doing something that will benefit us as well. Okay, so that's all about the what's and the whys that I'm going to cover at the moment. Let's get down to some of the aspects of writing accessible code. I'm not going to go through everything. I'm going to give you a few examples, a few different areas, and there are really just the tip of the iceberg, to be honest. So first things first, I just want to mention the accessibility tree. I will admit I was very lazy and I just got this diagram straight off of Google Images because I thought it kind of roughly helps. I didn't make this visualization myself. But this, I think, gives a pretty good idea of what an accessibility tree is in comparison to a DOM tree. Those of you who may not know much about how code works in the browser, essentially what happens in your application is your browser takes the HTML and then creates something called the DOM tree, which is with each of the nodes in this tree kind of representing a different element in your HTML script. And then, but also what the browser does is from that DOM tree creates an accessibility tree, which is a more kind of stripped down version of the DOM tree. It kind of filters out some of the unnecessary divs and spans and that fluff, and it will create a similar type of tree which focuses on the elements that a screen reader would use to help a blind user navigate through your application. So it will have, so that a screen reader can come in and then read out a button and what the button says and then what the paragraph says and the headings and things like that. So that's just a bit of context which will help going through for the next sections. Okay, now let's move on to ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which is a very unexplainable name that doesn't really tell us very much at all. But no worries, because I'm here to explain it to you. ARIA is essentially a set of attributes that can be added to HTML elements to make content more accessible. So I've just listed a few examples there. The most common ones you've probably seen are ARIA label. I have a few examples here. The top example is an ARIA label that's used to describe, that's used on a button element that's used to describe what that button is doing. So it's saying it's a close button. You can also use ARIA labeled by, which is kind of a partner to ARIA label. If you don't want to, if for example, in this little snippet I have here, you have this div that says it's a file, which is kind of the descriptor of what the file menu is. So you can say that this element is actually labeled by file menu. So then a screen reader will interpret that as like, oh, okay, this is a file. These are all files. This is a menu of files. Okay, so there are a lot of good and bad ways to use ARIA labels, and I've just kind of collated a kind of a list that I hope kind of is a simple way of explaining what's good and what's not good to do. And I'll just kind of go through them and one by one and give a bit more detail. The main point to be aware of is that semantic HTML and good design is always a lot better than using ARIA labels. In this top example, we have a button that is obviously a button that a screen reader will definitely interpret as a button because we have used the HTML element tag button. It's also being designed well because we say exactly what the button does within the tags. We know that this button is a send email button, and a screen reader will be able to pick this up and efficiently tell the listener what this button is doing, and that it is a button and that it's clickable. The second example is an example of where it's good they're using the semantic HTML, they're using the button element tags. But for example, maybe there are a lot of buttons on the page, and it might be confusing for a listener to understand which button does what. The text within the button maybe just says send. Maybe in another example, this is just like an icon that is a button which just has an icon in it, which doesn't mean much to a non-sighted user. So then this is an example of how you can use an ARIA label with semantic HTML to kind of add more clarity to what you have in the DOM. The next one, the next example is not a good example because they have the button, they have a label, they want to add more clarification, but this is actually an example of a pretty, I think, easy mistake to make, which I think I probably have made a lot before, and especially, you know, when you're first getting started with ARIA labels, you maybe don't really know what's the best way to do them. But the main issue with this one is that you're basically just repeating what the screen reader is already going to tell the user. So because you're using the button element, the screen reader will say that it's a button. And because it says send, the screen reader will tell you that it is a send button. So by adding the ARIA label send button to the listener with the screen reader, that just sounds like something. It will sound something like a send button or send button send button. So it's just kind of repetitive and annoying and not a good user experience. The next example down is also what not to do, and that is. And okay, I will hold my hands up and say, I probably did this a lot. I probably need to go back through some of my old GitHub repos and clean out all of the times that I did this. But it's when you have something that is for example, a div that you, for some reason, want to make into a button, and you don't use the button HTML element, and you think, oh, I'll just stick the ARIA label in there to tell everyone it's a button. Don't do this. Just use the button HTML element. It's there specifically to help for accessibility reasons. There are very few reasons why you would ever need to have like a div and then restyle it to make it into a button. This might be a bit of a contrived example, but one area that I think you see a lot, and again, which I have done a lot in the past, is using a div instead of like one of the H tags, or instead of a P tag, like just to put some text in there. Don't do that. Just always try and use the semantic HTML that is the most appropriate. And then you won't even need to bother remembering that you have to add an ARIA label. Always try and go for the top example here, because it makes your life easier and it's a better user experience for people that have screen readers. And then the final example is just like, no. At least, you know, it doesn't even have an ARIA label. We don't know a screen reader will not be able to really interpret what is happening here. It's just a div with send email. How do they know that it's a button and not a header? Or yeah, you can kind of get the idea here. All right, next thing I want to talk about is updating states. So this is, I find, a really interesting area of web accessibility, because when you think about how much we interact with things online as very able people with full sight, there is a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily think about, but we get a lot of visual cues from sites online that actually you need to put a bit more thought into in case someone has a visual impairment and is relying on a screen reader to be able to tell what is happening. A really good example is like the mute button. When we are on Zoom, how do we check that we're on mute? Well, we look, is the button gray or red? Is it crossed out? There's normally like an icon that's different. We rely on a lot of visual cues to help us interact with the digital world is basically what I'm saying. And there are a lot of very specific ARIA attributes that you can use to help your non-sighted users also understand what is happening and when states are being changed. This is a very long list, but you have things like ARIA checked, ARIA disabled, the minimum and maximum values and things like that are really easy with just like a little bit of JavaScript for you to be able to update and tell your listener what is happening on your site. This is like one example. You might have an HTML element, which is a progress bar. For a sighted user, you might do some funky CSS stuff to make it change colors or move or whatever. You'll probably have like an update progress function that will do some funky state change thing, and maybe you're using React and you've got some reducer stuff going on, whatever. You're doing lots of fancy stuff to make it look really cool for your users. It's really simple to just add a few extra ARIA attributes and, literally one line to your update progress function. And now suddenly your progress bar is accessible. And so this is a kind of an example of how web accessibility is not a huge ask. A lot of what can be done is just very simple, much less work than it actually takes to do the actual, all the funky CSS stuff. And even with the HTML examples, a lot of it is just thinking about it and then making a better design choice or a code choice. It doesn't take a lot of mental stress to make something accessible. And if you start thinking about it more while you're coding, you'll start to develop good habits, and then you won't even kind of realize that what you're doing once you've created that habit is, you wouldn't ever think that it was that much work. Okay, I'm going to talk about tabbing now. So this is more to do with people that use the keyboard to interact with a website. Maybe they don't like using the mouse. Maybe they're just, a very hardcore developer who likes to, not even has a disability or impairment, but just likes to use the keyboard. Or someone who has, a missing limb, or someone who has some other kind of physical disability. So what we mean, this is something that's really easy to test for yourself on your own sites and applications. If you just go to your site and see if you can navigate through your site well using the tab keys, using the keyboard, check when you're opening modules that you don't get stuck there, that you can still, leave and get to everywhere you need to be. To make your site more accessible for people that are using the keyboard primarily, it's really important not to remove the default focus highlights around, it's kind of hard to explain. I don't know what the actual official term is, but when you kind of click on a button, it has that weird glowy outline, the focus. I always used to really hate that because I was like, oh, why is it this ugly, like glowy blue color when, it's clashing with my beautiful design system that I spent 3 hours creating or whatever. And I would try to do whatever CSS trickery I could do to kind of remove the highlight. But don't do that. Once I realized how inaccessible that was, I've now, stopped doing that. Because if you completely remove that highlight, people that are using the keyboard don't know if they are focusing on the button and if they can click the button or not, because they can't see that they're focused on it. If you really can't stand the ugly blue outline, kind of restyle it. There are ways that you can do that. A few Stack Overflow posts, I'm sure, somewhere. Another thing to think about for users who are going to be using the keyboard to move through your site is thinking about the order in which you are tabbing through the elements on your page. You can and think logically about what you want the flow to be. You probably, if you have a navigation bar, you probably want them to tab through that first before going to the main content, before going to the footer. And that is oftentimes organized by the literal order that you put your elements in your HTML script. So you can imagine it would be a bit frustrating if you're trying to tab to the first line and then you have to go all over the show, go to the top and then down to the footer. And then if it gets, it's not a good user experience, basically. So try and make sure that your HTML is kind of in an order that you would expect someone to want to go through your page. You can also use tab indexes, which I guess a a relative of Z indexes, if you know much CSS. But essentially they are a series of, you can give your HTML element a number that kind of indicates what priority it is in the tabbing flow. These are really useful if, for example, you have a site which uses a lot of CSS flexboxes or grids, or you're trying to make things you know, adaptable for different screen sizes and responses in that way. It's really easy for the kind of tabbing order to get mixed up as you're kind of moving stuff around. So that's where a tab index can be really helpful to kind of maintain the flow in the order that you would expect. Okay, really brief point on animations. If you are a user, for example, who has epilepsy, you know, bright flashing colors and lots of animations is something that you really want to avoid. So I'm not telling you as a developer to not have any animations in your site, but just at least make sure it's not the only way of getting the content across, and at least enable people to disable them if they want to. Okay, so that was kind of most of the code specific stuff. And now I want to talk a bit about more design focused things. I know my audience is mainly developers, but assuming that a lot of you will probably work with designers or maybe are dabbling in design yourself, whether it's doing your own portfolio or just out of interest. Also, as developers, we are essentially like the last line of defense. We are like the last sanity check before a design gets, you know, put into code and then put out there for the world to see. So it's good for us to be able to just give a last kind of sanity check to the designs that are coming to us and be aware of how we can check whether it's accessible or not. A few different points. Firstly, let's think about fonts. You know, a lot of this stuff is also just good like user experience. I think everyone has probably experienced, you know, you're trying to look up, I don't know, a fancy gallery or maybe a spa for your mom's birthday gift, and you try to quickly look something up on your phone and they have this very fancy, like cursive font because it looks luxurious and romantic, but actually like you can't see what it's actually saying on your small screen. So think really carefully about the fonts that you're using and how readable they are, depending on screen size, depending on how sighted your user might be. It's a good idea to stick to like your Arials and your Helveticas and just avoid and stick to the sans serifs and avoid the serifs. You also want to limit the number of different fonts that you're using. This can be a bit of a cognitive overload for anyone really. Better to kind of stick to one uniform design system. Font sizes are normally, it's good to have a default of between 12 to 14. And also do a quick check that when people are on your site, they can do the command plus or whatever the equivalent is to zoom in and out, and it doesn't mess up the formatting. I have a very close friend who has a visual impairment, and she relies a lot on zooming in to things, and she is always complaining about how some sites she tries to zoom in and then the formatting goes all weird and then it's even less readable than it was before. Last one is text. Keep your text as text. Don't put images of text. Or if you are going to put an image of a text, give it a description so that a screen reader can interpret what it's saying. One very good example of this, I think is particularly relevant to us as developers is when we're writing coding blogs. It can be very tempting to just take a screenshot of your few lines of code and stick that in, but a screen reader won't be able to interpret the code that you have in the image. You should add a code block. And this is also a really good example of how thinking about making something accessible also helps your average user, because I know I'm personally always very frustrated when I go and read a blog that has some really awesome code that I want to just copy and paste and try out, and then I can't do that because it's an image and I have to go and type it all out by myself. It's not a good experience for me either. Yeah, so that's fonts. Now let's talk about color contrast. So this is a kind of a nice diagram which shows you how the different color combinations that you use can really dramatically affect how the different, like how readable stuff is. And there is like actual maths that goes into this, and numbers, which maybe don't mean very much to you, but this is kind of a brief overview of what ratios are kind of approved and not approved by different web accessibility standards. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines has 2 grades, AA and AAA, and they have different content color contrast ratios that that meet each standard. And depending on what jurisdiction you're in or what your client wants, they might want you to adhere to a certain standard. If the numbers don't really mean much to me, I'm not gonna lie, but that's okay, because there are like a million tools available online where you can just plug in your proposed color scheme, and then you can get some nice handy matrices that show you what is whether they're accessible or not. And I think what people assume, especially when it comes to the color choices, is that making accessible design somehow stifles creativity. And I think that's, and especially when it comes to color, people tend to kind of go on the defensive and think, oh, now I can't use the colors that I want because of accessibility. But in reality, you still get the whole rainbow. It's more about thinking about which pairs of colors you use together. So this example here, you have 6 different, you can have any 6 colors that you want. Like in this palette, you can see you can still use all 6 of these colors. You just can't use, you just shouldn't use certain pairs of those colors right next to each other. But you can still use them, anywhere else on your page. And even if, you have to have 2 colors together, it's sometimes just a very small change is needed to make a color combination go from inaccessible to accessible. Yeah, and I would argue if you're a good enough designer, you will be able to make really great creative products even within these kind of constraints. Okay, we're almost at the end. I just want to quickly talk about, or just show you really some of the standards and docs that you can find out there. So the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, has, which if you don't know, is basically like the UN of web stuff. And they have a web accessibility initiative, which kind of sits under them. And they have web content accessibility guidelines and lots of documentation that is very boring, but is good if you need to know like what the official guidance is. They do have one piece of documentation, which I really like, which is the ARIA authoring practices. I think I can just show you quickly now. Which is basically just a big directory like this, where you can go and just select any of the elements that you might be using on your site, like a toolbar, for example, and then you get just a series of bullet points about how to make sure that that toolbar is accessible. So that's just like a really quick way to filter out for the things that are most relevant to you, is to come to this site. I really recommend. Obviously, MDN Web Docs is also a really great resource out there, and they have a lot of good information about accessibility. And then finally, this is, I promise, the final slide, tools. Tools can help you if you are, no one is expecting you to hold all of the color ratios in your head so that you can, know them automatically and look at someone's design and instantly know if it's accessible or not. But that's why there's loads of tools out there to help you. Chrome, I know, as part of their dev tools, actually, I can show you again, has, if you just inspect, they have an accessibility tab over here where you can kind of see the accessibility tree, computer properties and things like that. if you are, oh, transcript generators, also great if you're producing any kind of online video content or a podcast. Accessible color matrices. You can also Google them, there's hundreds. Access lint is something that I haven't tried, but I found while I was researching this talk, which is basically a linter for accessibility. I haven't tested it, I haven't tried it, I don't know how good it is, but I just thought that was very interesting. I thought I'd mention it. Yeah, and there's also a lot of scans and auditing tools out there that you can basically just stick in the URL for your site and it will kind of give you a score for how good it is on some kind of accessibility scale and give you tips and tricks for improving them. Okay, that is all.